My introduction to the SNK games for me began in the early 90s, right when the first ever SNK fighting game, Fatal Fury, was released on home consoles. I remember getting the game and playing the first Fatal Fury game on the Sega Mega Drive, also known as Genesis in the US.
最強の男たちが今メガドライブに集結する。メガドライブ画廊伝説登場。
Loving the characters, the setting, the unique gameplay, and the rest was history. In fact, without me discovering that game cartridge and the story of the game, I will probably not be here today talking to you right now about SNK games. However, even though as a kid I also had a Super Nintendo, I never had the chance to try or play the Super Nintendo version of Fatal Fury until very recently, and boy, was I surprised.
父の叫び怒りに変えて飢えた狼たちのストリートファイトが始まる。今こそ本物の格闘を見せてやる。本格武闘アクションゲームスーパーファミコン画廊伝説。
Now before we talk further about this unique port, allow me to remind you that leaving a like is a huge help for the channel. Also consider subscribing if you have not done so. Now during my travel to Japan, I stumbled upon a very good and complete edition of the Super Nintendo or Super Famicom version of the first Fatal Fury game for a great price. Bringing the copy home, I was happy to see the beautiful and colorful manual and the great state of the cartridge. I knew that like all other SNK ports, Fatal Fury on the Super Nintendo was developed and published by Takara, the toy company turned developer that gave us some of the best ports of SNK games on console, including my all-time favorite, the King of Fighters 95 on the Game Boy. Upon finding the game, I was surprised to see the unusual logo for Takara, as I have never seen this blue screen before. This was probably the first red flag for things to come, or more like blue flag? When porting Fatal Fury, SNK's first fighting game, to the Super Nintendo, Takara decided to offer a unique spin on the game. This also happens to be the first SNK fighting game that Takara is developing. And it clearly shows. The first thing you notice, compared to the arcade or even the Genesis version, is the lack of an intro. The game directly boots into the main screen, offering the player an arcade mode, versus and options to lower the difficulty or increase the number of available continues. But the biggest surprise is when you start playing the game. So you probably know that the first Fatal Fury game introduced the idea of a multi-lane system. A system, to be frank, that I was not prepared for when I tried the game for the first time. But Takara, when porting the game, decided to remove the multi-lane system on the Super Nintendo for a more conventional fighting game experience. I was intrigued, as I always loved the Fatal Fury game and ports where the multi-lane system was disabled. Fatal Fury 2 on the Game Boy, Real Bout Special Dominated Mine on the PlayStation, or Garou Markov the Wolves. But it was still strange because the Genesis version of the game does have the multi-lane system. As I started playing the game, however, I noticed that the multi-lane removal was not the only change. Characters feel too stiff, and the controls are all over the place. This was expected from a fighting game in 1992, but even that, it just felt completely odd. I thought this could be my faulty memory, but I went ahead and fired Fatal Fury on the Genesis. And yes, it is completely different. The game on Genesis or Neo Geo is way more responsive. But going back to the Super Nintendo version, the stiffness is not the worst of it all. It is how inconsistent the hitboxes are. Doing the same move at the same distance from your opponent will behave differently. Sometimes your move is gonna hit, sometimes it doesn't, and it just feels weird. There's also this feeling of a delay between when you do the special move and when you see it on screen. It's kind of like lag, but back in the Super Nintendo days. It just feels really odd. This was very surprising, as both the Super Nintendo version and Genesis were released around the same time and both developed by Takara. The controls are also quite different. You have your punch and kick buttons and a third button which was used for the lane shift in the other versions, but here on the Super Nintendo is a grab button. Tap the grab button and close to your opponent and you will then be able to throw them around. Going through the arcade mode, I was also pleasantly surprised to see that all the characters from the Neo Geo version are present. This was not the case for the Genesis, as it removed both Huajai and Billy Khan and turned them into stage cameos. The Super Nintendo version also had its own spin on the bonus stage. Unlike the arcade version where you had the famed arm wrestling minigame, the Super Nintendo version of Fatal Fury 1 had you punch multiple tires flying at you from both sides. This was not some sort of 16-bit limitation of the Super Nintendo, as the Art of Fighting port on the console retained all the cool bonus stages from that game. Between matches you get a small story development as we see Geese always in the same image spouting hate speech against the player before facing you at the end of the game. Now if you were hoping to get an ending after defeating Geese or seeing him being thrown from his building, you will be disappointed, as the game ending is made of couple lines of text telling you that you killed Geese in 1993, and that's about it. Even the portraits used in the game were kind of different. Terry looks just odd. The music, on the other hand, is also inferior to the Sega Genesis version, but that's a comparison I'm gonna do in another video. I'm not gonna talk about that here. Now, looking at the game's booklet, I was happy to see that the CPU characters seem to be playable in the versus mode, as each had a unique special move and command that you can do. Naturally, I was excited to try the 2-player mode, but was surprised to see only the 3 arcade playable characters available. What was happening? It turned out only the second player can choose the other characters, and even that was not intuitive, as you are presented with the same select screen of the arcade. It wasn't until you press down that you get to see the other characters in a different select screen. Why? This was clearly looking like a last-minute addition to the port, and it shows even more when you try these characters. All have very limited moves. Some characters have no ducking sprite, and some of them the buttons just do not match the game control mechanics, the game controls. But even with all that said, I am very happy to have this version now, as it offers a unique take on SNK's first fighting game, which would be the beginning of the company's shining legacy. It is also amazing to see how Takara would evolve and progress from this port to becoming one of the best companies porting fighting games, especially on the Game Boy handheld. And that's again the topic of another video, because I love every single Takara port or SNK game ported by Takara on the Game Boy. That includes Fatal Fury 2, Samurai Showdown 1 and 3, King of Fighters 95 and 96, World Heroes 2 Jet, and Fatal Fury Real Bout Special. As I said, that's a topic for another video. Have you guys played Fatal Fury on the Super Nintendo? What are your memories playing that game? Did you own it? Did you play it back in the day, or are you playing it currently? Let me know in the comment section. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys next time.